I welcome today Jesse DeRose, who is a technologist and a storyteller. He helps engineering teams make cost-conscious decisions and believes the biggest challenges facing companies aren't technical, but human. His mission in life is to transform technology organizations by creating company cultures in which diverse, collaborative teams can thrive. What I loved about this episode is all the practical tips given by Jesse to be better at storytelling and collaborating with stakeholders, from how to align your goals to how to keep your audience engaged. I wish you a good listen. Hi, I'm your host, Magali Pellissier, and I'm a product manager. I can't believe I've already run this podcast for 5 months, and I wanted to say thank you. Thank you first to my guests who've taken the plunge to be in the first few episodes. It's been so fun and I've learned so much. Thank you to the people who've listened. We've now reached 1,000 listeners and the audience keeps on growing. If you like the podcast, please do share it around with your friends, family, and colleagues, and put a comment or rate it on your favorite podcast platform like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You are key to helping spread the word. This week is a bit special because it's a bonus episode. This time, my guest is a technical storyteller. As a product manager, a large share of our work is to tell stories, gathering them first from our stakeholders and crafting them into a valuable message. We'll uncover what makes a good product manager from my guest's perspective, based on varied experience in many different technology roles. Stakeholder management is a key skill for product managers. So if you want some tips on how to be better at it, you're in the right place. Thank you very much, Jesse, for joining me today. I'm very excited because you are my first guest who defines himself as a technical storyteller. So what do you mean exactly?
That's a great question. So it all started for me in a previous role. I had an amazing boss who had this background in wildlife study. She studied birds, migration patterns, she studied ecosystems, and then she pivoted from that into technology and customer success and customer enablement. And I was so fascinated by that. I was asking her one day in a one-on-one, how did that happen? What prompted that move? And she said, well, I noticed that the patterns are the same. It's just the application of those patterns that is different. So the patterns you see in birds and ecosystems, how they depend on each other, how they interact with each other, that tells a story. Their story tells how they work with each other, how they depend on each other, how those factors influence each other. And she realized if she removed the wildlife focus, removed the bird focus, and then applied the same concepts to customer success and technology, you saw the exact same things. Every company tells a story with the way that they work. Every company has interdependent parts, their processes, their documentation, how they communicate, how they collaborate across different teams and different departments. Or how does a change in one of those factors influence the others? How do the people, the processes, and the technology that make up the organization combine to empower or disempower the organization to achieve its goals? So taking a step back to see the pattern and the interdependent dances of people and processes within a company, that's what I mean when I talk about technical storytelling. It's seeing the forest through the trees in these larger organizations, especially in tech organizations, because those are such a hot ticket item right now. Everybody wants to be a tech organization. Everybody wants to move into the cloud. So I like to bring together the technical know-how and the business operations to achieve success and to tell those stories that will teach and enable others to learn from our mistakes or learn from our successes. You always hear the stories of a toxic work environment that somebody used to work in, and we think, that's definitely a red flag. Like, I would never want to do something like that, right? And then that's a story. That's something that you've now learned hearing the story from somebody else, that this is something I'm going to take with me through to the next job that I look for or the next role that I work in. Or similarly, like Google put out a book describing how their site reliability engineers build their organization, build their practices. And that book essentially educates others on the way that Google approaches operational reliability for its technology. So all these things are opportunities for storytelling, and then they fit into this technological space because there is that balance and dynamic and overflow with not just the content of what you're talking about, but not just the business processes or not just one particular area, but a lot of technical overlap and a lot of technical content that you also need to speak to.
Great, thank you. You are the first person talking to me about birds in this podcast.
So happy to be that person. Huge shout out to my previous boss, Kristen. She was amazing. She was so cool. I love to hear all of her bird stories.
Great. I hope she will be listening to this episode. Okay, so I think this episode will be very interesting for product people because they have to tell the story of a product and to talk to many people. How did you end up doing this? What's your background?
So I started a number of years ago with a degree in the management of information systems. It's essentially a mashup of a technical degree and then also some business degrees as well. But as soon as I graduated, nobody knew what to do with me because that particular field was still new. They were still figuring out what does this type of role look like. There wasn't a one-to-one mapping of going from this degree into a specific role or a specific field. So because I knew that I wanted to leverage both technical knowledge and business knowledge in whatever I did, I started with kind of 75% tech, 25% business split going into your call centers, technical support, IT help desk, where the majority of work was technical day-to-day, helping customers or helping internal users with technical support questions. And there's a little bit of business know-how that comes with that, but for the most part, you're focusing on technical conversations. And then over time, I moved into engineering operations work, which was more of a 50-50 split between, technology and business, because it wasn't just about the day-to-day work for me. I wanted to understand what are my company's goals and how does my work align with it? And that's something that wasn't as necessary for me in some of the previous work, but now moving into this engineering operations work, it was definitely important for me to know how I could be most impactful with the work. And then from there, over time, I moved into FinOps consulting as my most recent work, which was even further into business. It was about 75% business, 25% tech, because yes, the area of FinOps focuses on how folks are using or how folks are moving workloads and running workloads in cloud platforms, which requires some technical knowledge of those public cloud platforms like AWS, knowledge about data centers, knowledge about Azure, GCP. But each project also required conversations with stakeholders across departments and seniority levels to learn why they worked the way that they did. We always like to understand what are the things that that we don't, or what are the things that that maybe other teams don't. Why does this process work in this particular way? Why do these two teams not communicate with each other? What happened in the last month that prompted this anomalous spend? What are all the business contexts that that you might think is common knowledge, but through these conversations you might realize isn't common knowledge, or you think everybody knows, but we don't know because we're pretending to be a new employee essentially coming in and learning the ropes of everything. And all those conversations are stories. All of those conversations are the fundamental old school method of making sure knowledge is passed on through spoken word. We are, sharing business context to make sure that I, as a consultant or, any potential new hire knows this is how the business is run. This is why the business operates in this way, so that they can pass that knowledge on and continue to operate in the same manner.
So I want to take a step back in your career and go back to the time when you worked in call centers, technical support, and IT help desk. What have you learned from these experiences?
Those early days for me taught me that emotional intelligence or EQ or compassion, empathy, all of those ideas are critical. I would not be where I am today without learning all of those things from my early career. In any kind of call center, from anybody who's ever called in to help desk support for whatever reason, the people who are calling in are having a really bad day. All they want is their problem solved so they can go back to whatever they were doing before this interruption happened. And it's not their fault. They didn't purposefully cause whatever problem they're running into. They just want the problem solved so they can go back to what they're doing. And so the person who's on the other end of that phone or that video call or that text conversation, the person who is supporting them and helping them solve the problem needs to have compassion and needs to have empathy to help them get to where they want to go, to help them solve that problem, to help them understand, hey, I'm on your side. I understand, I'm here. I understand that this problem sucks for you and I want to help you solve it. Similarly, for engineering operations work, no one intentionally writes buggy code or microservices that aren't resilient. So, in a lot of cases, they simply just don't have all of the context or all of the time to do their job optimally. So you've got to be able to show everyone that you work with empathy. You've got to show that you're on their side and show them you're not here to make their lives harder. You're here to make their lives better with whatever questions you're asking, however you are showing up for them, and make sure that they understand that you are there to help. It's important to be on their side and show that you care about solving the problem just as much as they do. And if you do, they're usually more willing to share insights with you that can help you solve the problem. Because if you just have a conversation with somebody who is angry and upset and frustrated, and you just stick to the script and ask them the standard questions, they might not think that you care about solving the problem. But if you show that little bit of compassion or that little bit of empathy for whatever they're trying to do, that really helps them think, okay, this person understands what I've gone through. This person has been in my shoes. This person cares about actually helping me solve this problem, not just finishing this call and getting on to the next one. And that's a win-win.
And we all know what it feels like to be on the other side. We all use some products, some services, and we are frustrated and we have to get to the support team for that. Yes. So we all could have empathy for this. I think one of the main things I do as a product manager is just listening to those people talking, even if what they say is difficult sometimes, and just making sure that they feel heard. And in my experience, that is half of the job done. Just making them feel heard, they're happy.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I don't need to be the one making the decision, but I do want to understand why and how the decision was made.
In the next part of your career, you moved to DevOps and engineering operations. So what attracted you there?
So moving into engineering operations, I took a step back and started looking at the bigger picture. I realized that my team was no longer self-sufficient. So I wanted to be more involved in the strategic positioning of my team and how we worked with other teams to ultimately delight our customers. I wanted to make sure that I knew day to day, how did the work that I was doing, how did me showing up align with the things that the company was ultimately doing? So for example, I worked with Capital One for a number of years, or one of the features my team rolled out while I was there was virtual credit card numbers. And my team inherited the backend logic for this feature from another team. So in order for us to maintain and improve that service, we needed to know everything about the service. We needed to basically get a brain dump or a mind meld from the other team to understand this is how the backend logic works. This is how the functions work. This is how we built this code. We needed to understand everything they knew. And this required lots of storytelling to learn all the tribal knowledge and implicit business context around why the previous team built the service the way that they did. So that was the back-end logic. So we started by, ultimately we needed to get that information. That was a lot of storytelling to get all the business context and information from another team so we could simply build and run this service day to day. Now, this was just the back-end logic for this feature. There was another team that was responsible for the front-end logic of the feature, essentially what the customer saw for this feature when they used the feature. We needed to work closely with that team to make sure that both services, both the backend service that my team owned and the front end service that a different team owned, functioned smoothly together. We were interdependent parts that needed to align our work to reach our goals collaboratively. And that's why someone who works across departments can be so extremely beneficial. They can take that step back to see the larger pattern of those interdependent teams and departments and call out potential problems before they become problems. It really creates this great opportunity for everybody to be aware how they impact other teams as they work, whether those other teams are engineering or product or security or IT or something else.
And that's a good transition to talk about the role of the manager. So You felt at some point in your career frustrated as an individual contributor that you didn't have a clear understanding of the goals of the company and how that flowed through to your daily work. So what can managers in general do to be better at this and to make individual contributors feel like they are contributing to this higher level strategy?
Yeah, it's so important. I think the first thing is, as an individual contributor, or if I am an individual contributor on a team, I want clear alignment of my team's work with the company goals. So this could look like something like OKRs. Maybe my team is working on a feature release that's part of a broader goal to attract more customers. Knowing that information, knowing that this feature release that my team is working on is part of a broader goal to attract more customers, gives me purpose. I think another really important thing is a seat at the table. If my team is involved in building a specific feature, the team needs to be involved in the development or the strategy around that feature. Even if that's just the team manager or just the team lead representing the team in strategy meetings and roadmap discussions, if we're not involved in that product development, we might not buy into the work we're asked to do to build the product because we don't have context for why the decisions were made or why those particular features are important. It's really beneficial for us to know from the very beginning what's going on, what are the problems we're trying to solve, and then we can be part of that solution to help build that problem. And then we ultimately care about the solution because we were part of the brainstorming session that led to that solution. And then along those same lines, transparency. Transparency is so important for decisions and business context. I always like to think of it as I don't need to be the one making the decision, but I do want to understand why and how the decision was made. Simon Sinek says people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. If I'm an employee in a company, I want to know why my company exists and how my company operates from a high level mission perspective so that I know how to solve problems and remove roadblocks on my own day to day based on those ideas and based on those values. And I think every employee should have that knowledge.
Right. And if our listeners haven't seen, there is a short video on YouTube about this. People buy why you do it, which is really worth watching.
It's amazing. I highly recommend it for anybody who has not seen it.
Right. So you then moved to a startup in the business and tech consulting field to be the first engineer. What does it feel like to be the first engineer in a startup?
It's absolutely wild. It was such a crazy journey for me. It was exciting and stressful and exhilarating all at once. When I was given the opportunity to be this first engineer, I wasn't sure if it was something I wanted because the team was so small. I wasn't sure if the company would go anywhere. I loved the mission. I loved the idea of what we were doing, but it was still so early and so new, and I'm a very risk-averse person. So all those red flags and bells and whistles were screaming in my head. My mom always jokes that I specialize in creating something, a team, a project, documentation, and then getting it to the point of being self-sufficient. And that's really what I got to help do being the first engineer. The co-founders had a mission. They had an idea of what they wanted to do, but they were literally two dudes with no standard operating procedures for service delivery or product development. There was no clear employee development tracks. Our community education was ad hoc and it was all run by one person. So that was definitely a bottleneck. I got to contribute to all of those things. I got to wear multiple hats like people manager, scrum master, product manager. It was really rewarding to see the company grow based on my contributions and other employees' contributions as we continue to hire more people. But I will say it was also really challenging because there was a lot of work to do. And sometimes it was hard for the co-founders to hand over the reins to these people that they had hired to do this work. You know, they were so used to doing all this themselves before they started building this company and growing these teams.
And I can definitely relate to your experience because in my company, I am the first PM and it was a bit of a risk. And I asked myself the question several times, is this really what I want to do? And at the end of the day, it's very rewarding and you learn a lot. It's a great experience. So I'd recommend all the PMs who are listening to consider this option. Obviously, there's a lot of things that you can learn in a big enterprise company. You know, if you think of the big tech companies as well, I'm sure they are amazing. But this experience is something which is worth it.
I totally agree. I am so happy that I had this experience. It gave me so much knowledge and insight that I now get to take to whatever I do next.
So I have a listener who has recorded a question for you. So we're going to listen to it now.
Hi, Jesse. So my name is Anne-Sophie Legrain. I'm the head of innovation and digital solutions at PageGroup. PageGroup is one of the leaders in the recruitment industry, and I have about 8 years of product management experience. In your bio, you mentioned that the biggest challenge facing companies aren't technical, but human. And I must say that I completely relate to this. I believe that without a clear direction, some storytelling, there's just no buy-in. There's no adoption of your new product functionality, of your new technology. And that's something that I've seen over and over again, and that I believe has a big impact on whether your project is going to succeed or fail. So I'm really curious as to what you would recommend in order to shift mindsets or beliefs within an organization. Who do you convince? How do you convince them to adopt this new technology? And how making companies more collaborative, diverse, help you to achieve this?
That is such a great question. And it is something that I experienced in the last couple of years from my FinOps consulting. Senior leadership needs to agree with whatever you're doing, have your back, and not just have your back, but over communicate that to everybody in the company. They need to clearly express to folks in the company, hey, the work that this person is doing or the changes that this person is working towards are important. And I need you to prioritize them over other features that you are working on, other work that you are doing day to day. Number two, I think even more importantly, you need to make sure that the incentive structures within the company are aligned with whatever the change is that you are trying to accomplish. So, for example, in the FinOps work that I did, we always saw engineers who didn't think about cost as it related to the way that they architected and designed and developed applications and microservices and deployed them in a public cloud somewhere. Now, that is something that through their years of experience, through their education, they've never had to think about cost for these things because it's not something that's been part of the conversation up until now, when suddenly using public cloud has shifted that mentality. So maybe you can introduce new agenda items in your recurring meetings with these teams to look at cost dashboards or to talk about cost optimization items. Maybe there is something you can throw into your recurring quarterly roadmap planning sessions so that you are thinking about how do we ultimately optimize these things as we build them. But ultimately, it has to be something that incentivizes people to start caring about the things that you are asking them to care about. And taking all of that to empower employees, think about what are the tools your company uses day to day that you can leverage to make the happy path the easy path for your employees. So for example, how can you leverage your existing productivity suites, your existing collaboration tools, your existing design tools, your existing automation tools in a way that's going to be able to slowly train employees to change their behavior and to do the quote unquote right thing. I think those three things together are really, really important to think about.
As a technical storyteller, who are your main stakeholders?
The main stakeholders really depend on the problem that you're trying to solve. So for me, for example, in the FinOps work that I have done most recently, there's lots of work involving technical recommendations and technical discussions. So that definitely means that somebody from engineering or engineering operations is going to be a stakeholder for sure. But then whoever owns that bill, whoever owns the spend or the budget for the public cloud, whoever measures that spend against business KPIs for unit economic discussions is also somebody who is equally important in the story that I'm telling. And so that's somebody that I need to have as a stakeholder as well. And that might be, for me, that might be somebody in finance or another fiscal related department or fiscal related role. Similarly, we need someone to discuss product roadmap as it relates to public cloud, which means that we normally need somebody from the product team or maybe somebody from the senior leadership team. So that's 3 or maybe 4 different stakeholders right there. And that doesn't even account for any secondary conversations with other teams or other stakeholders that we identify over time. And then think about who is impacted by the problem at hand. If one person comes to you and says, hey, I've got this problem, I need to change the way that we do documentation, or I need to change the way that we think about cloud spend. Who's impacted by that? Who are the people who are ultimately going to need to change in order to become part of the solution rather than quote unquote part of the problem, or, they don't even know that they're part of the problem per se, but they are ultimately contributing towards this problem. And we can work with them to ultimately align them. Think about those people. Those are also stakeholders as well. Once you have this list of people, interview stakeholders and those impacted folks. For technical storytelling, this likely means you'll need to be able to speak different lingo to different departments. You'll need to be able to speak technical knowledge. You'll need to be able to speak business knowledge, finance knowledge, and other department-specific lingo, depending on the stakeholder, the persona who you're speaking with. And what information are your stakeholders and interviewees sharing with you that they're not sharing with each other or not sharing with other people? So then what's the bigger picture? When you connect the dots of all these stories from different stakeholders, what pattern emerges? That is what you can ultimately share back to all the different stakeholders. That is the way that you can define all the different stakeholders and be able to share that information back with them to make sure that they are all brought into the same conversation together.
So you also wrote an article I read recently about how storytelling can shape the cloud cost management strategy. So you argue in this blog post that a company's AWS bill is the sum of their business decisions. So can you tell me more about this?
Yeah, that was a really fun discussion when we came up with that idea. So every AWS bill, every public cloud bill is comprised of usage data. Which teams used which services to run their applications in that particular public cloud. Now, the big question is, how did those teams pick which services to use? That is a decision that is based on input from multiple teams. Obviously, the engineering team that is using the service, that deployed the service, they had certain technical requirements that influenced which services they chose to use. But then you also have inputs from product, maybe feature requirements. You might also have input from customer success, like product availability, service level agreements. All of those different teams ultimately have a say in what this usage ultimately looks like. So if you talk to each of those people, hear the stories from each of those different stakeholders, and combine all those conversations, you have a story of how your company is using AWS or any public cloud. You have a clear idea of these are all the different pieces of business context, the pieces of knowledge, whether that is tribal knowledge or shared knowledge, that ultimately led to the different parts of the company using the public cloud or using AWS the way that they use it. This was something that one of my colleagues was actually joking about. We were in the middle of working on a project for a client, analyzing their spend. And he made a joke. We were talking about how we were going through all these conversations with different teams and looking at different input from different stakeholders. And he said, it's kind of like companies' bill is the sum of their business decisions. And he was just joking, like he was just saying it off the cuff. But then we both stopped and had that aha moment together of like, oh my gosh, that's actually true. That's like a really, really legitimate thing, because the way that people are sharing these stories of business context and sharing these stories, product feature requirements, and maybe security requirements and other things, that all leads to broader patterns of usage and broader patterns of how different teams are either working with or against each other to lead to whatever that usage and spend is. When we're thinking about the AWS bill from business context, I might only know about my team's work within that bill or my team's contribution to that bill. But there are other teams also contributing to that bill. And if I don't have a shared mental model about how AWS works or about how my company uses AWS, we're not going to be able to collaborate and help each other solve the goals that we need to with our AWS spend. Tom Limoncelli has this amazing talk where he talks about high context versus low context. And the idea is basically that there are a lot of situations where teams or people, places, things don't share a lot of context, or very low context situations or low context environments. And it's a lot harder to thrive in those environments because you don't have the context that people just assume that you do. Whereas in a high context environment, people are always giving you information. They're always giving you that business context. They're always giving you information and context, so you know what you need to accomplish next. And so I always strive for high context environments, especially in my practice and my consulting. I always want to make sure that when it comes to AWS spend or any business operations, I want to share as much of that context as possible. It's really, really helpful for teams to know everything that I know. It's also important to determine your stakeholders' goals. In every story, each character is going to want something, and they might want the same thing or they might want different things. And it's really important to know what they want, because then ultimately you can have a better idea of, are people working towards the same thing together? Are people working towards different goals? It feels so counterintuitive to me to ask this question, like, what do you want? What are your goals here? But it can illuminate context that you didn't know. And it can illuminate context that the other person thought was common knowledge. Maybe they know about how AWS runs, or how the company uses AWS in a certain way, or their team uses AWS in a certain way that nobody else does. And then let stakeholders be the hero of their own story. Micromanaging is awful for everybody. I don't think I've met anybody who enjoys being micromanaged. You don't have to be the person to solve the problem, whether that is as a product person, whether that is a managerial person. You don't have to be the one to solve the problem. You can be the one that brings the right subject matter experts together and creates the space for them to collaborate to solve the problem. And then last but not least, I try to leverage non-verbal signals in my communication as much as possible, because it's not just about what you say, but how you say it. We've all been bored to tears in a conference call or a meeting at some point. The Neuro Leadership Institute mentions there's several key things that are required for learning and remembering information that you learn, which apply to storytelling here too, and really apply to this idea of, AWS is the sum of your business decisions, which is keep your audience engaged. If they're not focused, they won't remember what you discussed. And keep the content relevant and customized to the audience so they have something that they can connect to, and know how your story relates to their work. And then get emotional. Don't be afraid to get emotional. If you make your audience feel any emotion, it's going to make the storytelling more likely to be remembered. Whatever story you are telling them, they're going to be more likely to remember it. If you are excited and jazzed and telling your story and you're passionate about what you're talking about, that's going to make them remember it more than if you're just talking about it in a monotone voice and you're not really, they want to hear the passion and the care in your voice, whatever story you're telling. And then use your body language to signal that you're open to a conversation, because it's harder in today's technological day and age where you only necessarily see, upper torso profile. But if you cross your arms, people think that you don't want to have a conversation. If you put your hands on your hips, people think you don't want to have a conversation. But if you stand up straight with your arms at your side and use your hands to gesture, if you gesticulate a lot like me, that helps create this even power dynamic where the audience that you're talking to knows that you are on their side and you're working with them. Whatever information you've come to tell them, whatever story you've come to tell them, you ultimately are here to share that story with them and ultimately collaborate, move forward with them, and creates that sort of even power dynamic between you and your audience.
Great. Thank you again for those practical tips. There's some of them that I already knew, and some of them which are always useful to be reminded of, even though I knew them. I've been watching my posture on that call as a result. And final part of this podcast is when I make several propositions and you have to pick one of them. AWS, Azure, or GCP?
I have to go with AWS. That's the devil I'm most familiar with, or the demon I'm most familiar with. The others I'm sure have equally amazing pros and cons, but AWS is what I know at this point. So that's the one I have to go with.
Great. Startup or enterprise?
I'm going to go with startup. I really enjoy building relationships with everyone in the company. And that's something that you can do at a startup because the company is so small. With an enterprise, it's just not possible. There's just too many people for you to meet and get to know.
Storytelling in writing or through actual speaking?
So I am somebody who has always struggled with reading for pleasure. I did so much reading when I was in high school and college that just burnt me out from reading any form of physical book or even a digital book at that rate. So when audiobooks came out or became really popular alongside podcasts, so I would definitely choose storytelling through audio format, whether that is in whatever verbal way.
Great. Perfect. Thank you very much. So do you have one final piece of advice for product managers listening to this podcast and thinking, oh, I want to talk like this and be super engaging and I want to tell stories, but I don't really know where to start?
Don't be afraid to ask questions, regardless of how complex or simple you think that they might seem to the person that you're asking. So if there's something that you are not familiar with from a technical perspective and you're asking a technical person about them, don't be afraid to ask them what you think might be a very simple technical question. Even if you don't know the answer, give whoever you're talking to the opportunity to share what they know. Because in most cases, people like to talk about themselves and they like to talk about what they know and what they're working on. So create that safe space to let this other person share what they're passionate about and what they care about. Even if it's a simple question, even if it's a question that you think you might already know the answer to, don't be afraid to ask those questions, because ultimately those are the questions that can create vulnerable spaces to have more engaging, genuine conversations and lead to better relationships and better outcomes.
Perfect. And if people want to follow this advice and ask you some questions, what is the best way to reach out to you?
You can find me on Twitter at Jesse_DeRose.
Perfect. Thank you very much for this interview. I've learned so much and I really look forward to implementing those tips.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to listen to this podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode and that it has enabled you to understand your stakeholder and inspired you to better work with them to make successful products. If so, please share the link with your friends and colleagues. And if you want to suggest some topics, some guests, if you have questions you'd like me to ask during the interviews, or if you have any feedback, you can write to me at magalipellissier@hotmail.fr.